Hello, and welcome to the MKG podcast, the podcast that helps marketers grow their businesses using the 4 M's, the right means, messaging, media, and measurement. I'm your host, Carrie Gard, and to help me introduce today's guest, I have with me my partner in crime, Mike Crass. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. You promised that I'd never come back, and I'm back.
You're here for season 2. Let's talk about dying media that people are either no longer spending money on, or it's not something they're going to be spending money on much longer. What would you consider some of those medias?
I would say, just from conversations with people in marketing, communications, advertising on both the brand and agency side of things, there's a couple topics that come up. The first one is nobody ever reads email newsletters. Stop wasting your effort. You hear things like nobody reads billboards. Out of home is useless. You hear things like nobody watches TV because everyone's cutting cords and then spending an identical amount of money on a combination of Hulu, Netflix, HBO Go, and a million other subscription services, which frankly, you might as well have just kept your cable subscription at that point. So those are a couple of many that come up. And I know the first one I mentioned comes up more often than not. Nobody reads emails. Don't worry about sending them because nobody's going to read them anyways.
Really? I find that hard to believe because I actually subscribe to a couple big email newsletters, one being, and we talk about this on the podcast, but one being the Skim, which I subscribe to and actually has over 3 million subscribers. The Skim is a daily newsletter, goes out every day to women all over the country, where it helps them be in the know in the news of what's happening every single day. And so I find it incredibly useful, and I open it and it gets apparently like a 50% open rate. So why are you telling me that newsletters are a dying media? Because that sounds really hard to believe. Our
sample size here, you've got the Skim, which, not to correct you on the radio, I think they're closer to 7 million subscribers. Oh, they're huge. It all comes down, in my professional opinion, to what niche you're serving. Like the Skim speaks directly to a certain audience, certain gender, certain age, certain story types. You also see, newsletters that I subscribe to that are a little bit smaller. There's a guy by the name of Eric, and I can't remember his last name. He actually used to work as head of growth at Atlassian, which is a massive Australian technology company. He now works for another technology company in Chicago. And he has a newsletter called Techbound, and it talks about what are the most recent updates in Google algorithms and in search marketing. Now, he doesn't have 7 million subscribers, but when he publishes once a week his Techbound newsletter, it's a newsletter that I literally read every time it's published. And you have to see a couple common themes here. They're for niche audiences. It's not just hey, we're the Skim. You're a woman. Read this. It's actually speaking a little bit more accurately to that female audience of a certain age group. Same thing with Eric's newsletter with Techbound. He wants to say, hey, you are in the world of search marketing. Here are things you are going to want to learn. They're short. They're sweet. He's not writing novels, but they're very helpful in the process, and that's why I read them. Another great example is Crunchbase Insights, or CB Insights. It's a subsidiary of Crunchbase, which is owned ultimately by TechCrunch. They publish usually 3 or 4 days a week newsletter of all the different places that some of their research is being used and where it's being published and why it's being published. And because they have 100% A+ research, I want to know which journalists like the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or other places are picking it up. So that's something that I will also read every time it hits my inbox. It's not one of those newsletters that's just generic. They're speaking to a very specific niche, and that's me who wants to read their research.
So you're telling me that newsletters are not actually a dying media if you're doing them in a way that makes sense for a very specific audience.
The majority of newsletters are absolutely dying, and that there are these niche newsletters that are just standing up on their binary carcasses and saying, hey, while everyone else is dying, we are thriving. We are growing our newsletter subscriber base, and everybody is reading, everyone is responding, everybody is super interested in what we have to say on the specific niche topic.
And that's exactly what Sean Ryan has done. He has identified a very niche audience around men who really like expensive, I might be getting this wrong, but he's totally going to correct me in a minute, but expensive products, high-end products, products of quality. And so he's created a newsletter and has grown it. This is what's so fascinating to me, Mike. He's grown it to an exorbitant amount of people considering it's a niche audience, right? So it is not dead. It is very much thriving when you're talking to a very targeted person and you're delivering them content that really, really, really matters to them. And that's exactly what Sean's done and what we're going to learn all about today in my interview with Sean Ryan. Let's take a listen. Sean, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome, Carrie.
So you built an email newsletter list and with over 300,000 people. And today we're going to walk through how on earth you did that.
Sure.
It's amazing.
Okay. That sounds great.
So tell me, you started off first with finding a niche market, right? The key word there that people are going to hear throughout this whole podcast is niche. So tell us how you found that market and why it's working for you.
Yeah, so I've been in sales a long time, and I was fortunate enough to start working with a company called Cool Material about 4 years ago. And that gave me an opportunity to work for a men's blog that really focused on upscale men. What I found was it brought me into a different area of advertising sales where I could really focus on niche brands. And more importantly, I kind of was able to turn away from what I had been doing for years in advertising, which was scale and complexity. So my whole life was working with, massive media brands and helping them try to bring in brands at really high dollar value. And here you're talking about brands that almost had a nostalgic way of looking at advertising, although I don't think it's nostalgic. I think it's the most effective way, which was they basically were looking to have their message in the right environment and hitting the right audience. And they valued the synergy between the content and their brand, which is really refreshing. It took me back to my days working in magazine sales, which is aging me right now. But it was a time when advertising really worked well, when there was that great synergy between content and advertising. So working with Cool Material, I started working with a wide range of brands that really targeted upscale men. And it was really great. Number one, they're all brands that I could relate to. Number two, these were brands that weren't spending a lot of money, but at the same time, it was really more transactional. Basically, they were coming and they were working with us, and we would forecast the amount of clicks they would get. And if they got clicks near that forecast and they converted into revenue, then they would run with us again. It was really simple. So it took it away from this idea of doing all kinds of custom work, which generally is not effective. You're spending more money for a brand, but it's not really getting back to the core ROI, which is sales. So I really liked it. And so what happened was I was working with Cool Material, and fourth quarter is always the biggest time of the year, and most brands want to spend a good portion of their money around holidays. And I found that we were running out of inventory. So every fourth quarter, we would come up upon a time, ironically, which is right around now, where most of our inventory is selling out and we don't have any left. And so I was turning away advertisers and money. And for me, someone that's getting paid on revenue, that's not something that you want to do. So we were trying to think of what we could do. So I started talking to a lot of the brands that we work with, and I asked them where else they were spending their money. And they kept coming back and talking about email. So I was like, really? I didn't know that anybody read email newsletters anymore. I guess I just wasn't at the time doing a lot of that. But what you realize is that that's a pretty great avenue for brands. Number one, users are signing up for it, so there's intent. Number two, they're opening and consuming your content and your ad message, so they're a very engaged user. Whereas that's not necessarily what you're getting when you're working across the internet, across banner ads, what have you. So it's a really good avenue. I just didn't realize that it was an important one for these brands. And so we then decided, hey, we should try to launch an email newsletter that targeted these same men, with the hope that if we could grow it to be big enough, we could get these same advertisers who are spending on cool material to also spend in this newsletter. We would grow our revenue, and I wouldn't turn away any ad dollars. It was great. So we started. I'm fortunate enough that I work with a really good partner. He and I see things really the same way. So I was very lucky there. So Tim and I launched this company, and we started our first email, which was Elevator. And Elevator is a basic concept. The idea is, the big advantage is for Tim and I, we're the core audience. So we're able to sort of really look at what we like, and we're able to actually see, that's a good indicator for us for what other people will like. I'll tell you a quick side story. I once worked as an editor for a site called Heavy. I was a music editor. And this was something that I did on the side to learn how to write for search. And not to get into big detail, but generally the writers were paid on performance. So writers write for Heavy, and they have to write for search so that they rank really high in Google, because the more page views they get, the more money they make. And there was one woman who worked for Heavy who made so much more money than anybody else. And so as I'm trying to build out this music division for Heavy and hire these writers, I was able to sit down with her one day, and I was able to ask her, how do you do so well? Like, how do you do so well versus anyone else? And she had this great answer. She said, Sean, I watch a lot of TV, I read a lot, and I have a lot of questions. And I happen to think that the questions that I have are pretty much questions that probably 50,000 other people have. So I write the content around that. And that just really struck with me, because that's kind of the idea here. Tim and I are of the audience, and we assumed if we could find content that he and I liked, we wanted to believe that there were 50,000 other guys out there that would like it too. And that was kind of the basic of it. And so we set out to create Elevator. We curate content in there. We target this specific niche men's audience, the same one that we're targeting through Cool Material. And we built it up. And in the beginning, we got a few thousand subscribers from leveraging Cool Material. And we found that the open rates were really healthy. So that was just a good sign that it was working. And then from there, we started to think about ways that we could grow it to get it to a size that was big enough where advertisers would be interested in running it.
So you mentioned a healthy open rate. Can you give us, it can be a range, doesn't have to be specific numbers, but just so the audience, I don't know that everybody listening is a prominent email marketer. So what do you consider a healthy open rate for email then?
So when we didn't know, and when we use that ESP called MailChimp, and when we were looking in there, when we were looking at our category, which was like entertainment and men, like a decent open rate was like 15%. We're like, okay. But when we started this email, we had an open rate of like 50%. So we were like, oh, okay, so this must be pretty good. I mean, at least in the beginning, right? We have an open rate that's much higher. And then basically, as we talk more and more about this, as we grew, we're able to keep our open rate in that 25 to 30%, which is really high in this space, but that's a good indicator that people like it. So so to answer your question, it really depends on the category, but in our case, like 15% was considered about industry average.
Wow, and you were hitting around 50%, at least.
Yeah, well, we aren't now, but we were. At least in the beginning, we were. Yeah, so it was great.
That's crazy. So so you built this newsletter. You figured out your niche is this male audience based off of what you were doing with Cool Material, and then you started to create this newsletter. So tell me about where you got the content and how you came up with the content, because you're not writing it.
No. So our idea around this was looking at our own experience. I told you I didn't really read a lot of newsletters, but there were reasons why I didn't. Most newsletters that I would attempt to read, I always felt like were too much work. Like I would open an email from a partner and find that there was so much information in there I didn't understand. Do they think we have 2 hours a day to read an email? Like it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I signed up for my own. Yeah, I signed up for my own newsletters, and I'm like, New York Times had a great one about a woman that a woman wrote, and it took me 30 plus minutes to read. and I gave up. I unsubscribed.
So did I. So I think I did that all the time. So that was the first thing. We're like, okay, how can we come up with an experience where people don't feel like it's a burden to open the email? Can we actually create an experience where people feel like it's a good thing to get it in their inbox? So that was first. Visually was a big thing for us. I go back to my days where ironically, there were niche magazines. I worked for some like great niche magazines way back in the day, Ray Gun and Bikini, ones that no one listening to this podcast would probably ever have heard of or remember, but they were amazing. They were these small niche magazines, and it was such like a great time in the magazine world. And I was like, can we create something visually that feels like a magazine? So that was the second thing that we wanted to try to accomplish. And then the third was to just find content that I had mentioned before Tim and I would like. But the big things we wanted to do was we wanted the content just to be positive, and we didn't want it to be about news because you can get that anywhere. You don't need us for that. So we literally would just scour the web, and Tim and I were finding that when we looked for content and we shared it with one another, we were sharing a lot of the same content. So we were like, oh, okay, we both kind of see this the same way. And a lot of the times what we see, we've learned some since, but a lot of the times, a good indicator is that we just still have these healthy open rates. I mean, there's certain content that works a little better than others, but for the most part, what we tend to pick, because Tim and I have been around a long time and we're kind of the core audience, we do a pretty good job, I think, of finding the right stuff. So that's kind of what we do. So we only write a few articles.
Where do you find it? Do you just simply Google? Do you have certain websites that you follow on a regular basis? Have you sort of gone and done heavy lifting up front to curate the content so you know where to go on a regular basis? How do you find the content?
So we started out by scouring the web about all kinds of sites that we liked across different categories. We generally have a long list of them. So, we could have 100 sites that we sort of collectively pour through. There are like enhanced RSS sort of like feeds that we can use, like Feedly. We've used Feedly, but that's not necessarily finding the content for us. It's just kind of a good way for us to organize the content. And then we just go through it, a few times a week. We have actually someone that helps, and we go through and we just compile a list of articles that we like. And then from there, Tim will actually go in and find the ones that we use. So Tim really does all of the curation for Elevator. I will find things and put it in there to be considered, but Tim's really the one that does it. And I do all of the curation and content for Shift, which is the other one we have. But yeah, that's it. We don't have any like predetermined like relationships with any sites. We're dealing with what a lot of people are dealing with, which is number one, we don't want to just use the same sites all the time, because then people start to catch on and won't really think that we're much of a value anymore. And two, we have to pivot, now a little bit more than before, because a lot of sites are now trying to set up paywalls. So we try to work with those sites to tell them to give us links that would go around the paywall, because in essence, we're driving thousands of clicks to them for free, and they would be paying for that anyway. So it's a big advantage for them to work with us. And two, it allows us to continue to work with them. There are definitely some sites that we used to like a lot, but now we don't really use much anymore because of their paywall. And that's, it's just the way that it goes. But we're able to find enough content for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's tons out there. And so how you were talking about, previous newsletters that you subscribed to and how long they were. Is there a certain amount? Are you looking at one article per newsletter? Do you kind of pick a theme and do 2 or 3? How do you figure out what content you're going to share?
No, we usually do about 4 and a couple of images. That's kind of what we do. That's what we feel like is enough. And my expectation is really the way I consume Elevator is the way I think most users would. I mean, I go in, I usually find an article or 2 that I like, and then I like to click on the ad, and I hope that everybody else does. And then that's usually what I do. I mean, most times I don't go into Elevator and read everything. And that's the whole point, right? We just want people to go in, feel like they find something, feel like they found something interesting, maybe a conversation starter. But my expectation is you're not going to read every article that we pick, and that's okay.
Yeah, I love what you wrote on your website where you say it's like finding $10 in your pocket. Like, it's just like a nice little thing that brings a bright, shiny start to your day. And yeah, just
we have another one. We've had another one. We say it's like when someone in front of you pays for your morning coffee. It's the same kind of idea, right? It's just like a nice surprise. and that's hopefully what we do, and so that was kind of the idea. Very positive, uplifting. Well, I mean, kind of uplifting, but positive for sure. And just something where, again, the hope is that when it comes into your inbox, you're not like, yay, and not like, oh man, another email. This is terrible.
So you do four. Yep. So you do forward an email, and then how often? You started to say this. How often do you send them out through the week?
We started at 3 times, and now we're up to 6 times. We just sort of tried. We've gotten a general sense from readers that they like it and they don't mind getting it more. So, and the open rates have held. So we now have it up to 6 times, which it just started in 6 times in October. So we come out every day but Saturday. Sunday's edition is all video, which is the same premise, but instead of bringing articles, we bring videos, which is fun. And that's done well too. So yeah, I don't think that that'll be it. I don't think we'll ever go to 7 times. And a lot of what we do too, which we talked about this niche messaging, our plan is not to become too big that we're not a niche anymore. Like from an advertising standpoint, from a user standpoint, I don't want to be big. We set that up early on, that we said, look, it got to a point where it got too big. I don't want to do it anymore, which kind of runs counter to people that start companies, right? You want to get big and huge. We do not. If I'm going to get big, it's going to be from multiple niches and not from one giant newsletter. Because for me, having been in this business for a long time, as I was saying before, once you get to a certain size, you're then competing for ad dollars with a lot more competition and agencies, and it just gets a lot more complicated. And knock on wood, right now we're able to kind of circumvent that and just work directly with brands that can make a quick decision, because it's not a lot of money, to say like, okay, I'll try you guys, and if you work, we'll try you again. So I used to work for brands where the lead time was 6 to 9 months, and they would plan out a year. I mean, the good and bad is that this only works because I put so much time and effort each day into finding advertisers, but I have to fill 30 ad slots. What is it? 24. I'm doing the math. 36 ad slots a month, and I basically have to fill those every month, right? So I don't have advertisers that run all year long. So I'm constantly working the email and the phones to get people to continually run. But when I do get engaged with a brand, they can make a decision pretty quickly. So it does work. At least so far it works.
And this really comes back to your sales background, right? Because you have always taught me in all of our conversations that it's all about relationship building, right? And relationship building doesn't necessarily scale as a single person. So to really create that one-on-one conversation and to say to somebody that you hear them and that they're important to you, you need to do that in a very thoughtful way. And so by being niche and by saying, I understand you, single person who there happens to be 300,000 of, here's content you're really going to enjoy, and I've hand selected it for you, essentially, that's really creating that personal touch that you're so known for.
Yeah, we definitely try to do that. We definitely try to create, I guess, a dialogue between the readers and the newsletter, which is good. And yeah, from an advertising standpoint, that's true. I mean, I've always said my whole life, like, I'm not a rocket scientist, but I happen to just think I'm a nice guy and a good guy and trustworthy. And so I generally am willing to work, I'll work with brands, and I hopefully get that across, that I'm not trying to, put them into an unfair situation. I'm not trying to get them to pay more than they should. I generally find that if you're really open and honest with advertisers, and you share with them the challenges that you have as well as their own, that you can always find a common ground. And those advertisers that can't find a common ground, those are the ones you just don't want to work with anyway. So it generally kind of works out. I mean, I can tell you with almost 100% of the time, if I were to go to a brand and ask them to just pay more out of the blue, they would say no. But if I help them understand why we like them to do that and what we're looking for, they're much more receptive. So it's all about like honesty and trustworthiness.
Yes, and even in building that niche of an audience, and like you said, not wanting to be huge, it really comes back to that too, right? Of that open and honesty of like, I'm really speaking to you, the reader. of what we have to offer, and I'm trying to make this genuine and thoughtful, and I'm not trying to grow, because as you scale, like you're saying, if you get too big and you're trying to talk to too big of an audience, then the content becomes too sporadic, and then it's not that personalized aspect anymore.
That's right. I agree. Yes.
So it really comes back to being
So
niche and not being huge. So, okay, so you have your niche audience, you have the curated content that now you've scoured the internet for, and you've been thoughtful in picking, and you're delivering it 6 times a week, 4 articles per newsletter. How did you grow?
So when we started Elevator, it was a unique time. I mean, I think, I don't know if I mentioned this, but a lot of our success is really comes from just willing to try and fail, and also timing. I would wonder today, actually, I don't know. I sometimes wonder today, if we started today, would we have the same success? I'd like to think we could, but there was definitely timing before that helped us. And one of the things that helped us is that we initially started off on Cool Material, and we got an initial few thousand subscribers. And then we started growing it organically. We would try to promote it through some direct partnerships. But one of the big drivers for us is that we do participate in email sweepstakes. At least we did. We don't as much anymore. But it was the right time, and we were very deliberate in who we chose to work with. But we would participate in email sweepstakes that would feature other partners that were primarily male. And what would happen is that collectively, how these sweepstakes work is you have a set of partners, and those partners all promise to contribute a certain amount of email entries. They can figure that out based on their, what they know about their list. And then at the end, if you meet your minimum requirement, everybody gets a collection of that entire list of emails at the end to add to your own list. And so the big thing, obviously, is that as a user, you're signing up to win an iPhone. You're not necessarily signing up to get emails from 6 partners. But the way platforms work they're very clear in letting you know that if you sign up to win, you give us the right to basically email you. And so what we found is that we were getting a big chunk of emails from these sweepstakes, and I expected that when we added them, that great open rate we had would crater, because you would assume that most of those people coming in were really just trying to win, and they wouldn't be interested in Elevator. But what we found was the open rates were holding. We were like pretty surprised. So we would go from like 5,000 to 25,000 to 40,000, and our open rates would hold. They wouldn't hold at 50%, but they were holding at like a healthy 25, 30%. So that was pretty exciting for us. So we leveraged that for as long as we could. What does happen, though, is depending on the platform you're on, you can't work with the same partners over and over again, because even if they're good partners, you're just basically recirculating all the same emails, so that you'll be doing sweepstakes where you bring in a lot of emails, but a very small percentage are actually new. So now we still do that, but we host our own sweepstakes, so we can go in and find the partners that we want to add, so that we can get a lot of new emails at the end as opposed to a lot of duplicates. So that's where we focus. The second thing is we definitely work with partners in this space that are willing to swap ads to help one another out. So I have actually quite a few that run advertising with me, but I also have a few that I will call up and say, hey, I've got an open slot. Why don't you promote Elevator and I'll promote yours? And that's another way for you to capture emails. Obviously, organically, there's also opportunities where you can build a pretty good share a friend program. There's the woman's email that I can't believe I'm not remembering right now, the massive news email. Carrie, help me out here. That has an unbelievable share a friend program, and they grew to millions of subscribers. She knows. Is that it?
No, the name has slipped my mind too, but I actually subscribed to there for a long time. But it's true, the referral program was great, and you basically got swag from their own brand, which was something people wanted to be a part of. It just felt like you were part of their community and part of what they were building, and that was a really interesting way of doing it. Is that piece of community.
So there's that, and then obviously, look, there's the advantage of buying through social media. If you can work with someone as talented as you guys, for instance, and you're able to buy that at a very good and get a good CPA, that's definitely something you could do as well. We definitely test different things there. My partner Tim has a strong background in e-commerce because he owns a store through Cool Material. So we'll leverage social media like Facebook, and we'll try to hit a targeted CPA in order to acquire an email. And so it's always a mix, right? I mean, you know this, right? The more niche you come, the higher the cost. So we have to sort of figure that out. And what we'll do is we'll segment out those emails from our other list, and then we'll just measure how effective they are in terms of open rate. And if it's good, then we sort of roll them into our email list. And then we're constantly pruning our list. We're getting rid of a lot of people that haven't opened in a long time, and then we're sort of re-adding. And that's one of the big challenges you have in this space too, is that you want to constantly bring in new subscribers because it's just healthy for your business. It's healthy for the brands that you're bringing in. And so we're always looking for new ways, but those are basically the ways that we do it. We do it through just organically, through partnerships, through sweepstakes, and just hard work.
The point is, you do it.
I think that's the point. I think, we talked about this earlier, is that I think a lot of people do not do this simply because you think of so many reasons why you shouldn't. But failure is the greatest lesson of all. You just need to fail. You need to get in and fail and learn and fail and learn, and the next thing you know, you're building something. And if you just keep doing it day after day, it works. I mean, none of what we did was rocket science, but we just committed to doing it day in, day out, and we would just get the growth and you would get the momentum. And we've had lots of failures. And again, I always say failure is the best lesson. And so you learn from those failures and you pivot, and then that's how it works. But you just can't succeed if you don't try. It's too easy for anyone to sit there and say why they shouldn't do it or why it wouldn't work. We can all come up with that narrative pretty quickly. But the fact of the matter is, if you just try, you're going to succeed in some manner. You're going to succeed in building a list that's great, or you're going to succeed in the lessons that you learn. So maybe this lesson doesn't work, but the next one does. So you just got to get in there and do it.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does sound time consuming, at least in the front end of figuring out what the systems are, what your niche audience is, what the template of the email looks like, where you're going to find and curate the content. You've also mentioned, even while you guys don't write your own, you know of people who write their own, and
Yes.
how powerful that is. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the difference between curating like what you do and versus actually writing like some of the people you know?
It's so interesting. I think we were fortunate in that we have, created an identity for who we are. So users like us, but we do curate content. The higher risk, bigger reward is if you can create your own voice. I mean, it's absolutely true, right? If you're writing your own content and you're building up a significant list, right? I mean, that list is that much more powerful because they're not going to find what you have anywhere else because it's your own voice. I'll give a small plug to an email that I do actually like. It's called The Daily Valet. And that one is actually a writer. He's a terrific writer who goes in and he will just find 4 or 5 interesting things that are happening in the world. Some can be news related, some can be just sort of pop culture related. And he will actually take that and write it in his own voice. And it's this great daily informative email that if you I mean, I really, really like it, and a lot of that has to do with his voice. So, because it's his voice and because he's written this, I'm going to be that much more loyal because I know that I won't be able to find that anywhere else. So, if you can put in the time and effort and resources to write your own or put your own spin to it, I mean, that's absolutely a great value and something that will create an even more engaged subscriber base for you. So, yeah, I don't want to say that what we did is, what we do, I think works. We just happen to find the right mix, but there's a lot of value in emails like the Daily Valet or the Morning Brew or what we were talking about before, but all of those emails all really establish their own voice, and that's why they see a lot of success.
And it really comes down to what resources you as the brand have and what makes the most sense for your niche audience. I mean, if you're talking, it sounds like for you specifically, you have a very niche audience where there's already a plethora of content out there that's easy to curate. But if you're in a niche that is maybe new or is so niche that there just isn't a lot of information out there, then writing your own content might make sense. It really depends on taking a stab at that first piece, which is figuring out who your niche audience is, and then figuring out what's out there in the world and maybe what gaps there are or what information already exists.
I think also too, it's goal setting and expectations, right? If you come out of the gate and you want to start a new email in like women's tech, and you just have in your mind that it's going to be huge, and you don't set realistic, manageable goals, I think that's a recipe for failure. You could set goals to say like, again, just very small, manageable goals. If time is an issue for you, if resources are an issue for you, you can absolutely structure any email endeavor around the right goals and make it work, right? Like,
yeah,
Carrie, the point is like, if you don't have enough time to write 4 articles, then write 1 article and just start there and get your voice and get feedback and then build off of that. And make your timeline longer, and don't set goals where you feel like you need to be at a certain size or a certain length in your email by a set amount of time. Just give it more time and be willing to, just stay the course. So I think the answer here is that I don't necessarily think that anyone doesn't have the time. I just think that you just need to structure your expectations and goals the right way. And like we said before, just start doing it.
And figure out why it is that you're actually doing this as a brand. I mean, for you, it was personal. You just really connected to this, and it was something you really loved doing, and you happened to figure out how to monetize it. But for a brand who's not necessarily going to monetize it, who's going to use it as an avenue to bring their product to a new audience or to a niche audience, it's figuring out why you're doing it and why that makes sense, and building from there in terms of goals. I think that's such an important point.
And the other thing too is to think about brands, right? So you're a brand and you sell a widget, right? And when you sell that widget to someone, you ask them for their email and you compile this great list, right? So you have a huge list of subscribers that have all bought your widget. And then basically, what do you do with that list, right? So if you're not giving them value and you just keep going back to them to buy the next widget, like, they're going to unsubscribe. But there's just like tremendous opportunity where you've already established some basically positive vibes between you and that brand because they've already bought your product, that you could be delivering really good content to them that's related to that widget. Does that make sense? So you as a marketer who already has a list can just create more value for the subscribers you already have. So there's just so many brands out there that have a big list. I have so many friends that work for companies that have huge lists and they don't do anything with them. And if they were just to create content and value, they could hold on to those subscribers. They could create a dialogue with them. And then ironically, they could then have even a better chance to reintroduce widget number 2 or widget number 3 to sell to them. And I think that's
or
something
forward
that
it to a friend, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're growing by referral as well.
Yeah, and it's not it's not costly to do something like that. It's not creating like $1 million commercial. It's putting time into just create a stronger dialogue with your subscriber base, and as you said, Carrie, just encourage them to share and just keep that flame between you and that subscriber, and you can wind up driving a lot more value out of that in the long term if you just give them some value now versus just trying to sell them again and again.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Sean. This was fantastic, and I feel like for MKG, I'm going to go create our own newsletter.
Nice.
And well, thank you so
fun.
much. This was great. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah. All right. No problem.
So that was my conversation with Sean Ryan. Mike, was there anything that really stood out to you that was different than what you've seen happening in the world of newsletters, other than obviously being part of a niche audience, but in terms of the way Sean is doing this differently?
I'll come back to a comment I made in the intro of, oh no, all newsletters are dying, and interpret from that, well, if they're dying, maybe we shouldn't send them anymore. Sean actually said, no, you should send more newsletters. We actually send 6 a week. And I think Sunday was the big video one where they do a 4-pack of videos for their subscribers to read, or I should say to watch. So things that I believe are interesting to hear are, number one, if you've got a great newsletter with followers who are a big fan of it, send it more often, right? Don't just send it once a week, once a month. Send it 6 times a week. The other thing that popped up is, Sean and his partner are doing what I'm calling, it's my words, more of a 4-pack setup. So 4 stories in each send. That's not a huge amount of content to read. It's also very accessible. So you think about that user experience for their subscribers, and they're not being inundated with, 19 articles that are being, shoved in their face, which is like, even if I wanted to read all 19, I don't have time to do that. So it's just not going to happen. They're trying to make it a little bit more accessible. They're trying to say, hey, we're going to send it to you more often. We're just going to send fewer stories, so that there really are the 1, 2, 3, 4 stories that if you could squeeze these into your day, we think you'll really enjoy it. So those were 2 things that really jumped out at me, is just them learning from that user experience of how often should we send this? What should the content be? And now, like I mentioned earlier, they've got this Sunday video 4-pack where you don't even have to read anything. You could listen, you could watch, you could do a combination of both. It makes it a lot more accessible. And before I pass the microphone back to you, we were talking earlier today about a physical newsletter that a company sends out. We're both subscribers to it. And it's probably front and back, 14 pages long. I mean, it just feels like you open this thing up, you feel it in your hand, and it's heavy. And you open it up, and you're like, oh man, this is a small font. Like, even if I want to read all this, I just can't. It's with the best of intentions. I love the company that produces it. I'm actually a big fan of them and of their leadership team. It's very inaccessible. And so that was interesting to hear Sean say, hey, we want to include less in each send. We're just going to send it more often.
And I love that, because it does make it accessible and easy to read. Unlike the other one we were talking about, the physical one, it is very overwhelming and daunting. But when you approach a client, as we do on a regular basis as an SEO agency, we talk to clients all the time, and we're constantly like, you need more content. You need to produce more content. And when you're not writing content, you need to write some more. And they agree with us, but their resources are incredibly strapped. So as much as they would love to be producing more content, they don't necessarily have either the manpower to do it or the money to go outsource it. And I think what's also interesting about the way that Sean and his business partner approach this is that they're not necessarily writing the content. They're finding the information pertinent to this specific audience and bringing it to them from what other people have created. And I think that's really powerful, because it gives an outside perspective of not just what they think is important, but what other people are saying. And I think even in what our clients are doing, this is what also makes it accessible in terms of production, is you don't have to necessarily go write all the content either. We do something similar where we use a tool called rasa.io that actually creates a newsletter for us in bringing in links of websites that we and our experts read. And so then the newsletter just gets auto-created based off of what's happening on those websites. And so as easy as a newsletter is to put together, it's even easier when you don't have to feel like, oh man, where is all this content going to come from? And how am I going to write it all? And how am I going to do it 6 times a week? And that's actually not the case. And it's actually a lot more accessible than you can even imagine.
That tells a really interesting thought leadership story, right? If you're truly interested in your subscribers, here's the question. Do you really need to shove all of your own content down their throats and into their eyeballs? Maybe you are the Massachusetts Institute of Technology up in Cambridge, and you just have the greatest content out there. Total possibility. I would say for most brands, they would benefit from having some third parties in their newsletters and sharing that information to say, hey, subscribers, fans, customers, partners, investors, analysts, all you people out in the world that subscribe, here's what we're interested in. We might have written it, we might have researched it, we might have developed it, or we might not have. And we want to be a champion for other companies and other content producers and publishers out there in the world. So yeah, it's interesting to think of, you can have this mix of both owned and curated content. You can just do straight curation, the way that the group that Sean runs does it, or you could do, combinations of all the above. So it's really interesting to see what they've done and how their readers and subscribers have actually embraced just a pure curation model. I would say it's almost like what happened with Reuters and the Associated Press, but in a newsletter fashion. There's so many news stations, whether they're TV, radio, small newspapers, large newspapers, et cetera, that if you read where that story came from, a lot of times it's an AP source, and nobody really looks at that byline. And what Sean and his partner have done is they've said, hey, we can do the same thing in a newsletter. We can be that AP source that people are grabbing from, and we can gather up all those sources and give them to you in a very accessible format.
So true. Well, Sean, if you're listening, thank you so much for joining us. It was awesome to talk to you about what it is you got going on from a newsletter standpoint. If you'd like to learn or actually subscribe to Sean's newsletter, it's called gettheelevator.com. Check it out. Thank you for joining me on the MKG podcast, Mike. Always a pleasure. Looking forward to having you back. Can't say I didn't invite you.
Great being here for the intro and outro, and we'll see if I make a reappearance in season 3.
I can guarantee it. Thank you for listening to the MKG podcast, the podcast that helps marketers grow their business using the 4 M's, the right means, messaging, media, and measurement. I'm your host, Carrie Gard, and until next time.